Frank and Joe Hardy have helped their detective dad, Fenton, solve mysteries for the better part of a century now. And each iteration of the Hardy Boys and their pal Nancy Drew is a reflection of the time period in which the stories were written. This is the EPS podcast, and you're listening to a Season 2 short. Who doesn't like a good mystery? Following along with the adventure of solving a puzzle is fun for all ages and manifests itself in many forms of media, all of which are primary sources, by the way. My last guest at this summer's exhibit at Strawbery Banke Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, sat down to chat about the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, murder mystery dinners, and so many other entertaining options for amateur sleuths. All right, I'm being joined today by Martha, and we're at the Strawbery Banke Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I have my table of items, and I've brought this Hardy Boys book with me to almost all of my remote broadcasts since I've been starting to do this, and nobody has even thought about picking it up, but you grabbed it, and I'm so glad you did, because I love the Hardy Boys. What made you choose the Hardy Boys book?
The reason that I chose this book was because I was a Nancy Drew fan when I was a teenager, and read the Nancy Drew books.
I read these, so the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew have always kind of been paralleling each other, and I think there was pretty much the same authors that did both. You know, Franklin W. Dixon wasn't, I think it was a real person at one time, but then after a while they just, and it may have been a woman actually that wrote a lot of these books under the name of that, and the Nancy Drew ones were just like the girls' version of the Hardy Boys, getting the same kind of stuff. I don't know, did Nancy Drew have a revival in the 80s? Because I know the Hardy Boys did.
Not sure. Sure. I'll have to look back on that.
Because I remember what got me interested in them is that my older brother and his friends had the Hardy Boys, like the new ones from the 80s, and they had a lot of, like, I remember the first, the cover of the first one had like a big car explosion going off, and the Hardys are like jumping from it, and a lot more, violent than the ones from, so this is from 1959, the one you have, the Tower of Treasure, and it's the first installment. It's just one guy, can I just see the cover again? It's just like, one of them is, hiding behind a tree, and there's a beam of light coming from a tower. It's like not nearly as, dangerous as what they get in later on, which says a lot about the time period, doesn't it?
Right.
What was acceptable and what wasn't for young people to read. So the question that I chose for us to talk about is, what ideas and behaviors does this convey? And given that Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys are so similar, what seems to be like the lesson in those stories? Every single book, what seems to be the going lesson that you picked up on?
So mysteries in general have a happy ending for the most part.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I always drew me to, and still do, because I love to read murder mysteries, Agatha Christie and lots of other mystery writers. So I think that's what draws me to them is the fact that I know I'm going to get to the bottom of whatever has gone on, and we'll have a happily ever after at the end.
And it's usually pretty satisfying too, because it's like, if you've been reading closely through from chapter 1, there's usually something in the early chapters that comes back around by the end of it. Like, oh, that's why the dog was always barking at midnight.
Right.
It's like,
and you like to pick up on the clues as you're going through and try to figure it out yourself. And my husband and I have actually gone to murder mystery weekends where you have to, try to solve the mysteries. And I went also on a cruise, a murder mystery cruise, It was a train. No, not the cruise. The murder mystery train down in
that sounds
Florida.
really cool.
And I won a mug because
a mug shot for you.
for figuring out the murder, and that it was a little production that they put on as you were. It was a dinner theater sort of thing. It's fun.
It's fun. It's satisfying. It works the brain. Gets people thinking and stuff like that. And I think that's why people have always been interested in those kinds of stories.
Yes.
But these ones are geared much towards a teenager audience, or even younger than that, which says a lot too. I mean, because. And I didn't read Nancy Drew. I read Hardy Boys, and I always liked these earlier ones better. I never really liked the ones from the 80s because, like I said, they were always a little bit too edgy.
Know. Yeah.
And they were just trying to match the TV stuff. Some kid in the 80s isn't going to be reading, a simple 50s style mystery if there's the A-Team on TV. It's like, why would they choose one over the other? I like the older ones just because of how straightforward and kind of like simple they were, but the message I always got from it is that very rarely do people make a big deal about Frank and Joe Hardy's young age. Like they're treated like adults, and it's usually adults that they're going after, and in the story, and they're always kind of helping their dad out, who's is a detective as well, like a private eye, but they're solving the mysteries. They're the ones who are going on the big expeditions and stuff like that. And even though I know that the Hardy Boys go back beyond, even before the 50s, it seems like that era was really tailor-made for them, because for the first time, the American teenager was really like feeling their own independence. Like they were working after school jobs and making money that they got to keep instead of just putting it into the family coffers. Right. They
coming
were
into their own,
choosing a college to maybe go to, or buying their own car and driving that car around, where in previous generations that wasn't as common. And so,
I mean, at one point in time, children could only be seen and not heard. So there was a whole transition from that way of thinking up to the point where they had ideas of their own and could do things and were empowered.
It's funny the ebbs and flows with that. I mean, because you got you can run the gamut. Like this museum, I don't know if you went over to the Goodwin House, but there's a connection there between that family and Admiral David Farragut, because of the Navy yard right across the river here. And when he was like 13, he commanded his own Navy ship, because when he was a young person in the early 19th century, there was a lot of expectations. Like George Washington had, was worth like six figures by the time he was 16 years old from his surveying that he was doing.
Really?
And so that span of time from age 12 to 20 meant much different in different time periods than, where we get to in the 1950s, where, I know they're just characters, but they represent, like, when we're done with school and summer vacation, we'll help Dad solve crimes and, bring people. And I'm sure Nancy Drew is the same way, if not even more dynamic, because being a female character, showing that girls could be
on her own. It wasn't just,
she didn't have a sister that she and different iterations of the Hardy Boys sometimes put her with them. They hang out or they solve crimes together. At least in the TV series, they did that sometimes.
I don't know that I have I didn't know about any of that, actually. She was just an introduction to reading, basically, at that time in my life.
But it's kind of too bad, too, that one of the things that seems to come up with those two series, because there's so many books, they're almost like assembly line, just churned right out, kind of thing, that they're seen as like low culture literature or something. But from my way of thinking, I'm like, reading is reading. It doesn't matter what the story is.
And it's a nice introduction to reading, and, can open up vistas from there.
And show you how, because when you read a Hardy Boys book, I remember the first time I'll ask you, do you think it counts as reading if you listen to an audio?
Sure.
Okay, so
I listen to books all the time.
Because that's a debate. Some people are like, no, that's not actually reading.
What I like to do is crochet or do jigsaw puzzles while listening to a book. So that's a great way of
I would love it if I could find Hardy Boys on audio to listen to. I'm sure I could probably find it now, but I remember listening to Treasure Island, and that was one of those classics. I'm like, it's so old, it's probably not that good, But I remember when I listened to it on audio, I'm like, this is like a Hardy Boys story. It's very adventurous. There's like mysteries, there's twists and turns, and I'm like, this is great. I wish I'd actually read this as a kid, and not just written it off as being, old and therefore not very interesting. And so it's like these stories are kind of tapping into that. It's like when writing one of these Hardy Boys stories or Nancy Drew, they're like, let's go to some of those classic adventure stories and just update it, bring it up to a 1950s teenager and see how they would handle it with some of their abilities and stuff like that. So I'm always surprised that, like I mentioned, they've tried a few times to make them into TV shows, and a couple years ago, maybe like 20 years ago now, there was a Nancy Drew movie that they tried to make, but they never caught on for some reason. Unlike some other characters, they never leapt off the pages
or something. Beyond the
or maybe they're only good in their own time. Because in the 70s they did have a Hardy Boys series that was on for a little while, but they looked 70s. They had like the kind of mop hairdo and the longer hair and sideburns and the big collars and stuff like that. It doesn't look.
I guess we've moved beyond that to modern day. More realistic. Everything's more realistic nowadays.
And so it might be hard to ever go back to that age of innocence that these books kind of represent.
The genie's out of the bottle.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for stopping by and chatting with me about this. And
this was fun.
I'm glad somebody picked up on the Hardy Boys. Thanks again. This is season 2 of the EPS podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Short episodes like this one, which are products of my EPS podcast live exhibits, will be coming out on Tuesdays this season, while longer episodes, deeper dives into subjects, are posted on Thursdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS podcast. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.